Um, so maybe I would like to start by asking a question to do this exercise with me. Very simple. I would just like you to invite to think, if I say refugee camp, what is the image that comes to your mind? Think about that just for a few seconds. The first image, if I say refugee camp. So most likely, in fact, is something that might be similar to this image, which is an assemblage of fragile and temporary structure constituted by tents. This is an image of the Haitian refugee camp in Bethlehem, Palestine, and is captured in 1952. At that time, it was mainly inhabited by people that were expelled from southern Jerusalem villages in order to establish the Israeli state. Since then, these refugees are not allowed to come back to their original homes. They are just a few kilometers from the camp. But how the Haitian refugee camp looked like after almost 70 years of exile? This is the Haitian refugee camp today. I think the work of my last years trying to fundamentally make sense of this gap between how we still think about refugee camp and what they actually are in reality. And it's a reality that some of us experience, but also quite radically we are not equipped to conceptualize, to understand really this reality. This is a place, for example, where we cannot read in this urban space that look like a city, but in fact is not a city. It's not a city because in refugee camp you don't have municipalities. Refugee camps, for example, you don't have public or private spaces. Means not only conceptually you don't have these categories, means also that a refugee that builds the houses that you see here, they cannot be legally owned by refugees. And also, of course, since the camp, from the beginning, was structured in a way that should be, in fact, only temporary situation. So that the ownership of the land is, in a way, in a sort of suspended dimension. Most of the time is a space that is legally carved out from state sovereignty. And this was actually the mechanism that was very much used, and I think also is important to look back to the origin of the camp as a form to regulate, to control what at the beginning of the 19th centuries in most of the European colonies were looked at populations that supposedly to be dangerous. And these were the first camps were used exactly to control. And the control was not just about imprisonment of people that, again, were considered dangerous or to try to possibly control any revolt from the population. But also had another important aspect that I think is, in a way, the aspect that in these days is coming back very strongly, was also justify in order to take care of the people, in order actually to protect people. So, and that I think is an important dimension too, because in some cases, refugee camps are, in its origin, for some people, were really the space that could escape violence, and were really the space in which politics should not operate, because politics failed. Most likely there was a war, or other situations that people had to find that refuge. But that space, most of the time, become just a spatial and legal mechanism to exclude people, to deprive people from having rights. And the case, of course, of Palestinian refugee camps is such a relevant case because these are the oldest refugee camp in the world. So for me was, for example, the first question was to look at the history of refugee camp. And of course, when you already say something like that, is already something that, even for refugees, is something so difficult even to think in that term. But because what does it mean, look at history of refugee camp? The refugee camp should not simply exist on the beginning, and also we already assume that they should disappear very soon. So what does it mean that you want to look at the history of refugee camps? But still, when you live and you are in a place like that, that place has a history. I will try very briefly maybe to mention one of our recent projects, in a way also to understand how we try to engage in this very complicated and paradoxical situations. And one of our recent projects, when we realized that trying to trace the history was a way also to try to claim for refugees some of their rights, even simply the rights to live with dignity in these spaces. And in the last year, we started to document, we started to research and to build evidence for describing the Haitian refugee camp as a World Heritage Site. At the beginning, it started very much as a sort of provocation, but also then we started to realize that it was interesting in two different ways. One, of course, was a way for us to try to make questions around what is heritage? Why a camp has almost 70 years, it's almost 70 years old, cannot be declared as a site of important history. Because we realized that that history was not something only that organizations and state especially wanted to erase, but also it was something was self-inflicted by the refugee themselves, because of course refugees wants to go back to their land. But also imagine your life if constantly, in a way, you have to dismiss whatever you are and whatever you build in the place of refuge. And in this, don't think about only refugees as a sort of extreme case, and of course it is. But you can think also our more contemporary experience, in which we are more and more pushed to live our present always as a sort of temporary situations. Yesterday I was speaking, for example, with the students, how many students live, of course, the time here, but sometimes also this time is extended and can get an entire life in which you suddenly somehow are always aspiring to another place. You think I should move, and therefore you are not engaging in the situation that you live in. And you have the tendency to dismiss what is actually the possibility for you to be an agent of the present. Of course, this aspect in refugee camp is incredibly radicalized in a way because, of course, since the beginning, the refugees, you have to imagine the years of the early 50s, they couldn't believe they could not go back. People in the Haitian, they live only 10 kilometers from their original villages. They walked from their village, and they took refuge at that time there. Most of them, they left the house as it was, because they say, we are going to go back. So imagine what does it mean for a person, one winter after the other, to think about that the tent is suddenly, somehow is not enough. And you have a family, you have to protect your family, and therefore you have to start to build walls. And then the second winter comes, and the roof, is not enough, and if it's sometimes raining, but also snowing around Jerusalem during the winter, you start to question if you're gonna build the roof, you're gonna stay. And that for me are not simply some sort of humanitarian questions. These are for me, this is the architecture I wanna engage with. This is the political architecture that makes sense, because architecture in that case, it holds very fundamental meanings. And these were the meanings that I'm interested in trying to understand when working refugee camps. And that, I think it's important just to say it, because we are also, maybe say a few things also about the Loeb. I think maybe the perception that maybe some of the students might have is that we are just, let's say, these people that wants to do good, you know, with good intentions. But I think it's also important to understand that these social and political issues are an important intellectual challenge for architects. And I think we are equipped and we have all the possibility to engage. But at the moment, we are absolutely not engaging at all, because all of this is left to humanitarian technocrats most of the time, to international organizations, to NGOs. They're doing amazing work. But also it's not the work that architects actually can do. First, in understanding, because these are today urban spaces, but also, of course, to intervene in these spaces. So here, of course, I will not have the time to also to tell you a little bit more about the incredible tension and how that historical moment, in a way, creates a condition of permanent temporariness of refugee camps, which is very much, I think, an important way of understanding the city. And we can understand, in a way, for me, also the way how the cities today are structured from the perspective of refugee camp. But it's just that leaving to you just with some sort of important, I think, aspect of describing the context, I just would like very briefly also try to understand how we as architects, sometimes we are called to intervene, or we decide to intervene in this context, and creating an architecture that is not afraid to engage these issues. This is one of the latest interventions that we call the concrete tent. And the concrete tent is, in fact, not only a functional space, which is part of a project that I don't have the time today to talk about, which is called Campus in Camps, which is an educational space. In this case, the desire of the participants of Campus in Camps, students that were studying in refugee camps, felt that their discourse, in a way, was much more convincing and should have been grounded also in architectural form to be evident. So before I talked about these paradoxical situations in which somehow we have the tendency, and the refugee themselves, sometimes they look at their concrete houses as if they are made of tents and they can be demolished tomorrow, and how they live that contradiction between having a life in dignity, but at the same time fighting for the right of return. And for us, I think that was a very important tensions that we hoped to intervene. Here I just show you very briefly some images of a school that we built in Shafat refugee camp inside Jerusalem. This is a school for 1,000 students. And this is the first school ever designed by UNRWA. UNRWA is the United Nations agency in 70 years almost of existence. And the way how that happened is simply because we convinced them that as architects we can actually do something that an engineer inside the department of UNRWA could not deliver, because was their attitude. For them, building a school in a refugee camp is not an occasion to think about creating a collective space that's, for example, almost non-existent in spaces. And of course, also, for us, this was an important crack in this agency in relation to what actually architects can contribute to. So I'm interested also in trying to reinvent our profession where it is actually necessary, instead of just maybe waiting for the clients or running for the best clients. So here I can just give you some possible directions if you are interested to see more of these projects. This is one website, which is decolonizing.ps, where you have some of those projects. And this is the other site, which is campusincamps.ps, which is part of how the architecture is always together with a specific program. And if you have even more time, you can also read this book that we published in 2011 together with Sandy Lal and Yal Weitzman. It's called Architecture After Revolution. So thank you very much.